It's 15 minutes past the hour. To prepare for our coverage of President Nixon's visit to the People's Republic of China, we have, of course, been assembling a variety of research materials. A country that's been isolated from much of the world for more than 20 years. And one of the more interesting publications that we have found happens to be this atlas put out by the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. And even though the CIA did it, it's not a secret publication intended solely for intelligence purposes, but a general reference work using some unconventional maps and graphs and photographs to give not only the geography, but the economy and even the cultural patterns of China, a complex country. And to make the information easier to understand, the CIA has compared China with the United States. And we'd like to show you some examples. To begin with, China and the United States are almost equal in size. China has nearly 3.7 million square miles, the United States slightly more than 3.6 million square miles, and both occupy similar latitudes. Much of the land surface of China consists of hills, mountains, and high plateaus. 12% is plains, 19% is basins, and only 11% of the vast landmass is under cultivation. Like the United States, the major mountain ranges are in the western part of the country. Nearly 1/4 of the people of the world live in China, and close to 95% of China's estimated 800 million people live in the eastern half of the country. The density of the population is so great that in many areas more than 520 persons live within 1 square mile. The bulk of the population of the United States is also centered in the eastern half of this country. 6 cities in the United States, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Houston, have over 1 million inhabitants. 16 cities in China have over 1 million population. And the climate of most of China resembles that of the United States because of similar latitudinal locations, that is, the position of the continent on the globe, and general similarities in atmospheric circulation. For instance, the Manchurian city of Harbin is as far north as St. Paul, Minnesota. And Peking, the capital, has the same general climate pattern as Philadelphia. Wuhan is as far south as New Orleans, and Canton has the same temperature generally as Miami, Florida. Nearly all of the Chinese people are of Mongoloid stock. The dominant Han strain that makes up 95% of the population lives in the east, while the remaining 5%, which are called minority nationalities, live in the western part of the country. China is unified by tradition and written language, but differs in dialects, roughly divided into 4 major languages. Most of the Han Chinese use the northern dialect, now called Mandarin, the official language of the country. Agriculture dominates the economy of the nation. The difference between the average diet of the Chinese and the American are shown in these 2 graphs. 78% of the Chinese diet consists of starchy foods, while only 23% of our food is made up of such carbohydrates. 35% of our daily intake is from meat, eggs, fish, and milk, while only 8% of the Chinese diet comes from animal protein. And railroads are, of course, an important form of transportation in China. Since 1950, the Chinese communists have added 24,000 miles of railways. The length of the United States rail network, built mainly between 1870 and 1910, is about 9 times that of the Chinese railroads. 65% of the inland waterway network, another major form of transportation, is located in the southern part of China. China is a significant world producer of minerals like antimony and tungsten, and it has adequate reserves of aluminous ores, lead, manganese, mercury, and tin. But China is short on nickel, chrome, and cobalt. China's industry remains relatively underdeveloped, although its coal reserves and hydroelectric potential compare favorably with that of the United States, or for that matter, the Soviet Union. China is second to Japan among the Asian nations in gross industrial output, but ranks far behind Japan in its per capita output. And finally, the Central Intelligence Agency Atlas has an intricate aerial map of the prominent sites in Peking, the nation's capital, the setting for President Nixon's talks with the Chinese leaders. We'll be bringing you television pictures of the presidential visit, transmitted from the ground station in Peking up to Intelsat 4 satellite, which was launched last month by ComSat and is in an orbit 23,000 miles above the Pacific Ocean. The satellite, in turn, will relay the signals to a large ground station at Jamesburg in central California and into the transcontinental television cable networks. Since Chinese time is 13 hours ahead of Eastern time, the Today program will bring you the first full report of President Nixon's day-to-day activities, and we will continue doing so throughout the week. And with us throughout the week in question will be Mr. Donald W. Klein, who is with the East Asian Institute at Columbia University here in New York. And he will be interpreting and giving us background information on the news from Peking. And Mr. Klein estimates that he gave private briefings to no fewer than 30 of the journalists scheduled to accompany the president on his trip to China. So he's been rather busy lately and has a notion of what most of the reporters felt they needed to know before they went off on this assignment. Let me ask you first, and let's get it established now. I'll call you Don and you call me Frank. Okay, Mr. Klein, Mr. McGee stuff, no. Do you think that given the temperament and nature of the Chinese people, that they will accord the president what we would call a tumultuous or exuberant welcome, or are they likely to be more restrained just because of their nature?
Well, in terms of the nature, I think that they might like to be tumultuous about it, but I would think that the government in this case will probably restrain it somewhat, that it will be probably enthusiastic indoors, so to speak, at large banquets. But I would be surprised if they turned out, 500,000 people for this occasion.
Are the Chinese people by nature demonstrative on such occasions?
Well, they certainly can be. We've had a lot of demonstrations of it in the last 20 years.
Well, some of that could have been generated by government edict. I was just wondering about the nature of them. Do they tend to display or show their emotions, or do they tend to be more restrained about it?
Well, in personal relations, they're certainly able to restrain themselves. This is, part of the way Chinese often deal with one another. But on public occasions, I think that, they might be compared with a Fifth Avenue parade type mentality.
Is that good or bad?
Well, it depends who you're welcoming, I suppose.
I guess it does, yeah. What has been, or can you say, this is a fair question, what has been the central theme of the questions that the correspondents that you've briefed have brought to you? What do you think to be most concerned about?
This is the question that almost everybody asks.
Yeah.
And I think the major point of concern was, or is really, because they're not there yet, given the fact that they're not going to know much about what Nixon talks about with Zhou Enlai, what are they going to do in the meantime?
Yeah, how am I going to fill all that time and all that space?
Precisely. And the answer seems to have emerged that they're going to follow around Mrs. Nixon more than we might have expected under normal circumstances.
Because that's the only show in town as far as
well,
I'm concerned.
It seems this way.
Yes.
She's going to be visiting a commune and a hospital and a school and, a couple of other things. So it will give correspondents a chance to, see China as it is.
Before we break away, you only have about 30 seconds here. Why do you think the Chinese are willing to have this visit at this time?
Well, this is open, obviously, to a lot of speculation. My general interpretation is that they are very, very nervous about the Soviet Union.
I see.
We now know that they are digging air raid shelters all over China in the major cities. And the Russians have perhaps as close to 1 million men, armed men on their northern borders. This is worrisome. So that's very worrisome.
Enough to give pause, isn't it?
Certainly.
And time now for a station break. I'm going to continue talking with Donald Klein here about the president's trip to China, all aspects of it. And I've been curious, it's said time and time again, and I think probably with some justification, that symmetry as a form of diplomacy really doesn't achieve all that much. But we're tempted to believe that the Chinese are perhaps substantially different from the rest of us. My question, obviously, is whether you think symmetry as a form of diplomacy would perhaps be more effective with the Chinese than it would with some Western society.
Frankly, I doubt if it makes much difference with the Chinese. I mean, they've dealt in their share of international conferences. I think a lot of the American public has the idea that, this is the first foreign leader that Chinese have ever seen. But they've dueled with some of the best of them, including Nikita Khrushchev, for example, in recent years, Kosygin, and so forth. And at a less hostile atmosphere. They were major participants in the Bandung Conference.
It's true.
Both Geneva conferences, they played a very major role. So symmetry is no new game to them, least of all Zhou Enlai.
He has traveled, I guess, about as much as any world leader in recent years, has he not?
I would say, if you stretched it back to 1949, when the Chinese took power, He's been abroad at least 25 times, on major and extended visits. For example, this is only an 8-day visit for the president. He's gone off on 6-week junkets and this sort of thing.
Well, the sheer longevity of his term in office, I would suppose, we'd be safe in saying that he's traveled more than any world figure.
I would think
as
so.
As a world figure, has he not?
I would say so, yes.
Mm-hmm. It's been said many times, the United States really can't seem to make up its mind about China. We either have one of two extreme attitudes about it, and we're told that they're xenophobic and they resent foreigners. But is there not a little trace of at least naivete when we feel that simply because we haven't been in touch with China over this last 2 decades, that it has been isolated from the world?
Yes, in fact, this is sort of one of my own major themes in this. The Chinese.
Elaborate on it.
Well, the Chinese, for example, right now have diplomatic relations with 67 different nations, which I don't describe as isolationism on their part. They've been conducting foreign trade with about 100 different countries, even those with whom they didn't have diplomatic relations. Their diplomats have been stationed just about all over, except the Americas. This they've been fairly well blocked out of, North and South America. But, of course, as we know, they now have people in Canada, for example, and Chile and so forth. But they've done an awful lot of moving around in cultural levels, sports, trade, you name it. They've been involved.
What would you expect first to result if I may use the word of a concrete nature from this? Would it be a further relaxation of trade between the two countries, an exchange of cultural figures, athletes, what? What would you expect to come first?
Well, I would think that both sides have an interest in some level of trade, but I would emphasize that it would be very, very modest levels. And the reason I think this to be the case is because it's one of these things that's, mutually beneficial, so to speak. President Nixon would obviously like to come home and be able to say that, we have begun low-level trade, or at least some trade. And I think the Chinese, for their part, would like just to demonstrate to an American public and the businessmen in this country that there's a potential. Because every businessman alive, sees this dream of this absolutely staggering market, the largest in the world, potentially.
800 million potential customers.
Right, exactly.
In what areas is the trade likely to take place?
Negatively, it's worth looking at, if I may use this sort of backdoor approach. They're not going to buy consumer goods. They're not going to buy automobiles and refrigerators and television sets. I think what they'd like mainly is high-level technology.
I see, some pretty sophisticated...
Well, in the computer business, I don't know what our attitudes on this might be, but...
We got to take a station break.
World Championship Tennis, live and in color from Toronto, Sunday afternoon on NBC.